Good day, you beautiful people. I'm Frank Gilbert. This is The Harsh Truth. Back to making some videos, hopefully on a regular basis, but we'll celebrate that later. Today is a day of remembrance. We know what day it is today. It's September the 11th. It was 18 years ago that everything you see on your screen right now, it all unfolded in front of our eyes. Today, so many stories we can go into, Antonio Brown, so on and so forth, but we're going to save all those for tomorrow, a video that I'm going to do. Today is the day about remembering. Today we're going to remember everything that happened on 9/11. So while we have a couple of minutes until the Fox News coverage that I'm using from YouTube kicks in, we'll go into me answering the obligatory question as to where were you when it happened. So here's where I was when it happened. I was actually managing a Subway sandwich store in Dayton, Ohio when it went down. And I was the only person in the store at the time. None of my day crew had gotten there yet. And I was listening to WTUE, to Bob and Tom, in the morning. They were interviewing, I want to say it's Sebastian Bach, the 80s guitarist. For those of you who are music lovers, you guys will know who Sebastian Bach is. During the interview, they interrupted him and said, hey, there's reports of a plane crash in New York. As soon as we have more details, we'll let you know. And then they got back to the interview. A few minutes later, they mentioned something about it being a pretty serious thing in Manhattan. Odd that a plane would crash in the middle of Manhattan, but yeah, I mean, crazy shit happens. We all know that. So they cut away to commercial, they come back, and they mention that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. Now, at this point, we do not yet know how serious this is yet, and here comes the news footage. But after a few minutes of interviewing, they kind of finally figure out what's going on. They say, ladies and gentlemen, especially I think this was after the second plane had hit. They said, ladies and gentlemen, there's been another plane crash in New York. We're going to cut away to the news footage, or to the news radio, so they can discuss what's going on. And that's where the day began. We were not particularly busy at work that day. Obviously, a lot of people were glued to their TVs. They weren't going out to eat anything. I actually work and live very close to a military base, so obviously there was a lot going on around here that day. We were also subject to a lot of the fear that came about. Every little noise. There's actually a neighborhood over here we have the National Air Force Museum here in Dayton. And it's actually about 10 minutes away from where I live. And just on the other side of the fence line from that, in the public area, is some housing called Page Manor, where a lot of military families live. A transformer blew. And for those of you who have seen a transformer blow, there's sometimes sparks, a loud bang, that kind of thing. It's generally a benign thing that happens from time to time everywhere, but it's a very loud boom. And when you're already on edge, seeing what's been going on TV, then you start to wonder. There was a little brush fire that had started out in the field at the VA Medical Center in Dayton. Everybody is saying, oh my God, it must be terrorism, it must be terrorism. No, it's just all those crazy things that happen. Now, eventually we get to the footage that we're going to see, that we're watching right now. And boy, there was just a lot going on. We're gonna go over probably the first hour or so of footage. We're going to talk about some of the things that they were saying, look back in hindsight at some of the things, and then I'll give some final thoughts, and we'll call it a day. And there's the first images. Even today, as I look at that, I'm like, Jesus Christ, that's mind-boggling. That is absolutely insane. I watch this footage every year about this time because I want to be reminded. You know, it was a significant thing in my life. I remember, because I was 25 when this happened, roughly. It's one of those things that, you really do remember kind of a lot about that whole day is very, very clear in my mind, even 18 years later. Everything I did, everything that happened, all the details, staying up till I think 3 or 4 in the morning watching news footage, just looking for any more information, trying to make sense of all this shit in my own head. You know, I think what he says kind of shows just how confusing this whole thing really was. You don't know how somebody could miss one of the biggest buildings that has ever existed on such a clear day, unless it is one of those, as he says, needle in a haystack accidents where it's just this perfect storm of shit going wrong and an airplane ends up flying into one of the World Trade Centers. I think he actually misdated the World Trade Center bombing. I believe that was in the early 90s, not 89. I believe it was in 93, because I was in high school when that happened. I remember that getting a lot of news coverage when I was in high school that day. There was TVs that were on all over the place, and we were watching that as it was unfolding. You know, we're just a minute or so away from the second plane hitting. It's kind of odd how you go from what a horrible accident to, holy shit, we're under attack in that real, just quick moment. Kind of mind-boggling to watch this. One of my favorite movies when I was a kid was The Towering Inferno. And never outside of that movie have I ever heard of a situation like this where, regardless of what the reasons were that the fire started, that 100+ stories in the air, you have a fire burning and you have no real way of putting it out, which makes me wonder, what can you really do to put out a fire at that point? Now, let's say for a minute that the buildings didn't fall, that there is still, you know, opportunity to get in there and do that, to get in there and try to fight the fire. And we're about to see the second plane come in. If you look at the bottom right hand of your screen, there it is. Yeah, it was at this point that it goes from wow, what an unfortunate incident, to holy shit, someone is trying to kill everybody on the East Coast. That's kind of the level of fear that it spiked to at that point, because one plane, maybe it was an accident, maybe it was deliberate, maybe it was an accident. Two planes, who would have fucking thought of some shit like that? I certainly never would have. I'll put a link to this particular video in the description also. This is the live coverage from 8:46 a.m. when Fox News first went live to 5 o'clock p.m. I think it actually stops about 4:45 in the afternoon that day. But this is a solid 7.5 hours, give or take, of news footage. The first 7.5 hours or so of coverage from Fox News. And those of you watching this, if you're screaming, why Fox, not CNN, this is just the one that I have saved. I actually follow a YouTube channel called JFK 1963 News Videos. They have a bunch of historical live news footage, going all the way back to when Bobby Kennedy was killed, when Kennedy was killed, things like that. Several elections over the course of the last 20 or so years, going all the way back to, I want to say, the 84 Reagan landslide. They have some live news coverage. Not particularly long videos. I mean, some of them, the older ones, are only really an hour long, maybe. But yeah, as news has gotten so intense, so insane over the last 20 years, we have bigger blocks of coverage like what we saw on September the 11th to pull from. Also, back then, a lot of that footage, you know, if you get back to the Kennedy days, some of that footage just wasn't saved. So it's kind of hard to dig it out. And props to this guy who runs this channel for finding some of that older footage. Again, it's JFK 1963 News Videos. I'll put a link to his channel in the description as well. And man, look at that. Just, there are some bits of footage out here of this second plane hitting, of the collapses, that are actually just mind-bogglingly amazing views. There's one on that came out a year or two ago of a police helicopter that was actually circling the trade centers as it collapsed. And that is one of the wildest things I have ever seen. It seems like every couple of years we get a new perspective of the events of that day. Somebody who had a view from this angle, somebody had a view from that angle. And it really is like watching it all over again at times, because you haven't seen that particular point of view, you haven't heard that particular group of people react, and you actually hear at several points over this particular footage and the buildings are collapsing, that people are just screaming in terror, and it's visceral. It really gets into your head. It chills you to your bones at times. I've seen this footage I don't know how many times, probably double-digit times, and still to this day I get kind of mesmerized by it all, despite the fact that I almost literally have it memorized. I've watched it so many times at this point. It's definitely something insane. I don't want to go too much down this road of conspiracy theories, but I love when people say it's a drone that flew into the trade centers, it's a drone that flew into the Pentagon. It really wasn't. I mean, come on, people. Take a screen grab of that and just look. It's pretty clearly a passenger plane. I mean, I understand. I understand why people want to make everything that happened that day fit into a nice, neat little box. And it's one of my theories about conspiracy theories as a whole is that the human mind is fragile. And when something extremely traumatic like this, or the Kennedy assassination, or something like that happens, if we can't make the explanation as big as the event, then we have problems processing it all. And I think that's one of the reasons why, and I'll use the Kennedy assassination as an example, I think that's one of the reasons why people have trouble understanding it. Probably all the significant information says it was one asshole in the book depository that got lucky with a rifle. That's all the pertinent evidence says that. There are a lot of outlying things that don't quite fit, I agree, but we have trouble processing the fact that we watched a president die, so we have to say, oh, it was the mob, it was Russia, it was Cuba, it was the CIA, it was Johnson. And I think it was a lot of the same with 9/11. All these people looked at these images and justifiably had trouble processing what a lot of it was. We just, knowing what it was, just having trouble processing exactly what it all meant. And you start thinking, oh, well, Bush did it. Bush knew it was happening and let us do it, which there's no explanation as to why. I mean, explaining why isn't important to conspiracy theorists, just that it happened. You know, you look at this and it's really hard to kind of put it all into a place in your head where you can start to understand all the angles of this particular situation. And you know, I get it. It's traumatic things happen. You have trouble understanding them. I had a friend of mine who lost her fiance in a car accident several years ago, and she was trying to blame the driver of the other car, even though kind of all the evidence, at least all the evidence that I heard, suggested that it was actually kind of his fault. Not intentionally his fault, but he made a mistake that led to the accident, and that's kind of the way it goes. But you have trouble kind of wrapping your head around the facts of these traumatic events, and so you start to kind of create the story in your own mind as to why things went the way they did. That particular view, before it zooms in, it puts in perspective just how big those buildings really were. I'm actually very disappointed I never got to see the World Trade Centers with my own eyes. Funny enough, in either 99 or 2000, when I was still married, my now ex-wife and I were heavily considering going to New York for New Year's Eve, but we kind of scrapped the idea because I don't want to cram myself in with 600 million other people who are drunk and obnoxious. I've actually had some friends of mine who have some piloting experience say, if you can drive a car, you can steer a plane. Landing and taking off is a little bit more complicated, but simply steering a plane is not hard. As a matter of fact, I think in the weeks and months after 9/11, as they discovered that these guys went to flight school in Florida, and that's how they learned to control the airplane and run the autopilot and change course and all that, they had expressed when they were there that they didn't want to learn how to land or take off. They just wanted to learn to fly straight. So it should have been pretty clear at that point these guys had some nefarious intent, but I mean, you really don't know what somebody's going to do. So I don't fault the instructors here at the flight schools in Florida for not understanding what these guys' intentions were, because how were they really supposed to know? But yeah, it was just proof that they had no intent at all of actually landing this aircraft and making demands or anything like that. That their intent was to do exactly what they did, to fly these airplanes directly into the building. And that is a crazy sight right there. Again, you can see in perspective just how big those buildings were. I mean, the skyline of New York is just riddled with high-rises anyway, and those buildings are almost twice as big as 98% of the buildings in Manhattan. It is just insane to go up there and see how big those buildings are. Man, that's crazy. You know, again, there's a good shot of the perspective of just how big those buildings really were. I'm kind of in earnest planning a trip to New York in the spring for me and my girlfriend, and I am eager to see with my own eyes from different angles around Manhattan just how big the new Freedom Tower is, because it is built specifically to be as tall as, I think it was One World Trade that had the big antenna on top. It was built to be that tall, to the foot. And I am excited to think about getting the opportunity to go over there and see that visually, because I've been to cities before. I mean, I grew up in the Bay Area out in California, so I've been to San Francisco. I've seen big structures. I've seen the Golden Gate, the Transamerica Building, Coit Tower up on Telegraph Hill, things like that. I've been to LA. I've been, I'm in Cincinnati regularly, though there's not a whole great deal of high rises in Cincinnati. A great city, the Queen City, but not buildings like the World Trade Center or the Chrysler Building or something like that. But I'm really excited to go see New York and pay my respects at Ground Zero for all these people that were lost. And here's another view of that second airplane. I don't think they actually released any footage of the first airplane hitting until there is some more footage after this that runs from, I think, 5 o'clock or 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon until midnight. And I've watched it a little bit here and there. I don't watch it at great length. But I think it was later on that evening or that night that they finally released some footage of the first plane hitting. I think there's actually 2 video clips that I know of the first plane hitting. One of them was taken by a documentary crew that was actually with one of the fire stations in New York filming a documentary, a separate thing. I don't even remember what it was about. And they are sitting there talking to these guys, interviewing them for the documentary, and they hear the plane and they turn and look up just in time to see the plane fly into the side of the building and catch the explosion. And it's one of the weirdest things I've ever seen. You know, another thing that conspiracy theorists like to say when they talk about 9/11 is, oh, all these people say they didn't see any windows on the plane. Do you know how big a plane window is? Unless you're standing right next to the plane while it's on the ground, it's kind of hard to see a window on an airplane. I mean, I live right next to an Air Force base, and I see planes fly overhead all the time, both cargo planes and passenger-style aircraft. And one of the roads that I drive on pretty regularly is a road that actually runs right by the end of the flight line. So as you're driving down this road, you've got airplanes coming across you like this that are only a few hundred feet off the ground as they're coming to touch down. And sometimes I can't see the windows on those, and they're only a few hundred feet high. So, excuse me, you're looking at a plane that is 1,000+ feet in the air. It was traveling awful fast. They were not at cruise. They were probably at least at cruising speed, if not at max throttle, because these assholes wanted to do some serious damage. I don't know what you could really make out detail-wise of the plane, but whatever. I mean, like I said, these traumatic events, people, they're not going to misremember. They're just not always going to be able to interpret what they saw, or even sometimes didn't see. So I don't really fault these people or hold them in contempt or anything. You know, when I was experiencing this, I actually didn't see any news footage, any visuals at all till after, I think it was 6 o'clock by the time I saw any visuals, because I was at work. I didn't have a television on me at the time. I didn't have access to one at the time. So I was going on what I was hearing, and just hearing that the buildings fell down was one of the craziest things I have ever heard. But when I finally got to my parents' house, which is where a lot of my friends and some of the relatives I have in the area had kind of congregated to deal with all this, it was the first time that I had seen the buildings fall, First time I had seen the planes driving into them. The first time I had seen any imagery at all. And for the first hour, I just sat on my parents' couch and just watched. I mean, I remember just kind of sitting there with my head resting in my hand, leaning on the side of the couch, just trying, the visually seeing everything was so much different than just hearing it be described over the radio. I can't imagine what it was like to see some of this shit as it was happening. A lot of people were kind of miffed as to how they started blaming Osama bin Laden. I mean, because what, they're 41 minutes into the Fox coverage right now. And I think they've already mentioned bin Laden once or twice. A lot of people were kind of miffed. How are you already going to bin Laden? Oh, that's just more proof that it was all a conspiracy and they blamed him and used it as a reason you'll get him. You got to remember, bin Laden had been a thorn in the side of the United States for several years, really a couple of decades. He was behind, the Taliban and Al-Qaeda was behind the USS Cole bombing when Clinton was president. They were behind embassy bombings. They were behind or part of planning things like, I think they may have had something to do with Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie, Scotland. Barracks bombings. These guys have been a thorn in the side. Osama bin Laden specifically had been a thorn in the side of the United States for several years, a couple of decades. So it wasn't at all outside of the realm of possibility that this was one of the guys that could have been responsible. Not to mention, he had already, I think at that point, had been named in a plot to crash or hijack 18 planes or something like that in one day around the turn of the millennium, around 2000. So, yeah, the guy definitely had it in for us. He definitely had a thing for airplanes. And they mentioned already, I think, that a couple of the guys that were already on trial for other actions not surrounding 9/11 were licensed pilots. So, yeah, it makes perfect sense to look at this and say, hey, if you know what you know about intelligence and who really doesn't like us and what their capabilities are, it's not outside the realm of possibility that it would have been somebody like Osama bin Laden. Imagine being where I grew up on the West Coast. All this starts at, 5:30 in the morning. Most people aren't awake at 5:30 in the morning. So, you wake up at 7, you got to be at work at 9, you get your shower real quick, you walk out and you flip the TV on to pour yourself a bowl of cornflakes or to make you an omelet and get your day started, and these are the images that are all over the place on every channel, every news outlet, everything. I think even ESPN was running this footage. I'm pretty sure there was not a channel out there, except for maybe some of the premium movie channels, that weren't showing somebody's news broadcast. People give the intelligence community a lot of shit when something like this happens. How did you not see it coming? How did you let this happen? Yada, yada, yada. Look, their job is absolutely impossible at times. I remember reading that when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, that the intelligence community back then was hearing that Japan was planning something, but they put out so many different places around the world, or especially at least around the Pacific, that they were going to attack, or that they were looking into attacking. One of them even included Pearl Harbor. You don't have the resources to spread around to properly defend all of these places. So when you hear somebody from the Taliban over your intelligence sources say we're gonna do something big to America, what are you gonna do? Because honestly, before this, Pearl Harbor was the last time anybody had actually hit us on our own land, and that was forever ago. So ideally, you're starting to think, oh, they're going to go after another, embassy somewhere overseas. They're going to go after some military base overseas. Who in a million years would have thought that they would have been this brazen, this bold? I wouldn't have. But so even if there was some kind of intelligence gathering that had found out that they were planning something, how are they going to know what it is? It could have been anything. They're getting pretty close to announcing a couple of pretty significant moments in this whole thing. One is we're getting close to getting the first words of the plane crash at the Pentagon. The other thing is grounding all air traffic nationwide. which I think either had never been done before or had only been done once. Certainly hasn't been done since. There certainly isn't a whole lot of call to do it through any other incidents. So it's those are two pretty significant things that happened over the course of the day. They're getting the first reports of the people that were jumping out of the trade center. Boy, I feel for those people. I mean, that sense of hopelessness to where that sense of hopelessness where you feel like jumping from the 90th to 100th floor is your best option. That's disheartening. Any decent person would hear those people's stories and think, good God, why? I've discussed with a couple of friends over the years the possibility that there were more hijackers in the air that day that just didn't get a chance to hijack their planes and do damage. Was New York the only target? Was there also somebody in Chicago that wanted to fly an airplane into the Sears Tower? Was there somebody in Los Angeles that wanted to fly an airplane into the Capitol Records building? Was there somebody in Seattle that wanted to fly an airplane into the Space Needle? That's because you have to wonder, how much worse could this thing have gotten? It seems now that it was localized to New York, but it's not outside the realm of possibility if you look at everything that happened over the course of the day to think maybe there were a bunch of assholes in a lot of different places around the country that really wanted to just drive the dagger right into our backs. I would be shocked to find out that that wasn't the case. It appears that it wasn't because the stuff didn't make it outside of the New York, D.C. area, and then of course the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania in Shanksville. But it's not knowing sucks. I would like to know for sure if there wasn't some other terrorist cells out there around the country that were just like, we're going to go ahead and bail out on our plans and we're going to live to fight another day and see what other kind of shit we can get into. You know, I see the helicopter flying by. It reminds me I was having a conversation with someone about why can't they have a helicopter go to the floors, to the upper floors to get those people. You're seeing it, kids. I mean, you can't land a helicopter on a building where the upper floors are on fire. You know, for those of you who don't understand how the aerodynamics of helicopters work, there's a massive updraft over a fire, and helicopters are not particularly heavy. Even the heavier helicopters are not as heavy as fixed-wing aircraft. Those crazy updrafts created by the heat from a fire would probably throw that thing all over the place. Then you'd also be looking at helicopter crashes all over Manhattan. So the struggle before realizing that these buildings were compromised fatally was, how do you get up there and get to these people? An aerial rescue is not possible.
The White House is being evacuated. That comes to us from one of our Fox producers.
You just reported the White House being evacuated. It's actually kind of shocking now that I think about it that it wasn't done almost immediately after the second plane hit, and it became pretty clear that there was some terrorism involved and not an accident.
I don't want to incite any undue panic, but there is a report only, of another aircraft that has crashed on Interstate 395, one of the main routes in Washington, D.C.
And that's the first report of the crash at the Pentagon. It was at this point that I went from being blown away at what was going on to being legitimately afraid down in my core. Because at this point it goes from, oh my God, what a terrible tragedy, to holy shit, there's another airplane, somebody's actually attacking us, to holy shit, is anywhere safe? Because now it's not just New York, now it's Washington. Who knows where this thing is going to spread? And it was at this point that I'm starting to legitimately feel some fear. As I said, I live right next to an Air Force base. And it's not a small Air Force base. It's not an unimportant Air Force base. I've heard stories for several years from people that have grown up around here that this is actually considered to be one of the primary targets if anybody were to nuke us. So, yeah, living right next to there's the first video of the Pentagon on fire. But yeah, it was at this point that I kind of wondered, is there an end to this thing? How many more airplanes fall out of the sky and crash into buildings and kill people? It was at this point that I first legitimately started to feel fear. This was only the second time in my life that I felt that fear down in my bones. How do you even fight a fire? I mean, if you're a fireman, go down in the comments and let me know. How do you even begin to fight a fire in a building that tall? Conspiracy theorists like to say that it was a missile that hit the Pentagon. I don't know if we're going to get to this point in the footage, because I'm not going to sit here and commentate all 7+ hours of this. We'll probably go for another 20 minutes or so, and then I'll end the video, because at that point it was really just a lot of talk. I mean, the meat and potatoes of the day was pretty much done at that point. But at one point in the video, the guy mentions that the hole in the Pentagon was 100 or more feet wide. The plane that hit the Pentagon was a 757, which has a wingspan of 140 something feet, I think. So it very easily could have been. It was. I mean, let's face it. It was an airplane that hit the Pentagon. It was not a missile. You'd have to be kind of foolish to look at some of the pictures that we end up getting from the Pentagon, look at that hole and say, oh, well, it's only like 40 feet wide. No, there is a reporter who later, at some point in this video, I don't know if we're going to get to it or not, says that the hole is 100 or more feet wide, and the wingspan of a 757, which they know is the plane that hit the Pentagon, is 140. I think it's 145 or 147. I forget, but it was definitely not a narrow hole like a lot of people want to say it is. And because my big mouth was running, and you probably didn't hear it, they just announced that all air traffic nationwide had been grounded. You know, he asked if the Pentagon would have been protected by any anti-aircraft weapons or have any physical defense. I don't think the Pentagon would necessarily need it. You're not worried about people attacking the Pentagon as much as you are people trying to infiltrate and get information out. That's my thinking of it, just kind of stepping back and looking at it from a broader perspective. If these images, of course, prove me wrong, people are totally willing to attack the Pentagon physically. They flew an airplane into it, after all. But I would imagine even today, there's probably not a great deal of physical defenses against an outwardly attack coming into the building. They're still more concerned with information getting out. It's interesting to think about the kind of preparations that hospitals in cities like New York make for incidents like this. Growing up in California with earthquakes being kind of a constant threat and you never being able to know when an earthquake is going to pop up, I would imagine that a lot of hospitals in the West Coast have an emergency plan that's a lot similar to that. Because I was actually a kid in California when the Loma Prieta quake hit in 1989, and I can't imagine what the hospitals were going through that day. There was just so much going on. You're doing it without power. You're doing it without, probably running water. At least in New York, these hospitals had power and things like that, so they were able to deal with it. Thank God. I mean, who knows? We could have had a bigger body count if they'd had to deal with the loss of any resources like power or water. But just the sheer number of people that needed medical attention that day, everything from the easy stuff to the hard stuff to life-saving treatment. That's President Bush taking off from Florida in Air Force One, and he was just flying around the center part of the country for several hours. The Secret Service and the military secured him real quick. We probably won't get to the point in the video where he makes his first statement. Yeah, that's not a drone, sorry. That's not a drone. I'll have to get Aaron on here soon. We'll have one of our big 9/11 conspiracy theories talks on camera, because those always are very entertaining to be a part of with Aaron. Everything going on, we haven't even gotten to the first reports of the plane that crashed in Pennsylvania yet. And they even mentioned it here in their coverage. Any other day, that plane crash would have been the lead news story. They would have gone on and on and on about it for 12 or 24 hours. But it got kind of lost in the events of the day. I don't even think they put up any footage of the crash site or the surrounding area until, I think it was that night. It was probably 7 or 8 o'clock that night before they actually put any footage on. They mention it later on in the coverage. I don't know if we'll get to that point or not, but that particular section of the Pentagon that the plane hit was actually kind of lucky, all things considered. It had just been renovated and remodeled, and they hadn't yet moved a lot of people back into that section of the Pentagon. So there wasn't nearly as many people in that section as there would have been had they attacked 6 months earlier or 6 months later. And there we see the first building come down.
Jim, do you know anything about what kind of plane or helicopter is involved in that Pentagon incident?
I do not, but I can tell you...
You think somebody would have been in his ear right away to tell him what was going on?
Damage and fire. I can't tell you how large the smoke plumes are coming from the Pentagon.
Jim, let me interrupt you. We are looking at live pictures of the World Trade Center literally starting to crumble. It is falling apart as we watch these pictures live. The World Trade Center, 110 stories, literally starting to fall. Bill Daley, let me bring you into the conversation. I know this was the terrorist strike back in 1993.
Mind-blowing picture of the events of the day right there. All of southern Manhattan just engulfed in debris and smoke and dust and soot.
As much as these buildings were built to withstand a certain large hit.
I mean, you can go back and take a screen grab of that. I mean, that is a
structural integrity.
That is a picture of just how fucking insane that entire day was. You know, another thing that conspiracy theorists like to say is that looks like a controlled demolition. Obviously, there was some bombs that were preset in there to bring the building straight down. The only thing I can tell you guys is gravity still works. Even on a day like today where everything seems to be going so insane, gravity is a constant. Gravity pulled those buildings down. There is a logical explanation why the buildings fell the way they did. Gravity pulled them down. They did not topple them over, they pulled them down. There was a lot of variables going on in there. There was a lot of heat. There is a pretty good video that I saw on YouTube that explained exactly explained the anatomy of why the buildings fell down. They talked about a cascading failure. I encourage you to go look at that. It's pretty informative as to the reasons why the buildings came down the way they did. Also, people kind of wonder, conspiracy theorists kind of wonder why the buildings around them were damaged. There must have been bombs planted in those buildings too. Look, take a look at that building falling down. That is 110 stories of rubble coming down, and not just down, but out. So it makes perfect sense. A lot of that debris was slamming into the buildings that are surrounding it. So yeah, those buildings were pretty beat up. They were pretty damaged. They were probably already on fire too, because they mentioned earlier that there was a lot of burning debris that had shot down to the buildings, had fallen down from the World Trade Center towers. So it's not unheard of that some of that burning debris landed on top of other buildings and caught those buildings on fire. So they were probably already burning when the World Trade Center towers collapsed, and then they hit them with debris. So yeah, that's why there was so much damage in that area. You're looking at 210, 220 stories of building coming down in a very uncontrolled manner. That was not a controlled demolition. That was gravity pulling down the buildings that were very, very badly damaged. There's nothing controlled about that day. Conspiracy theories like to jump on that too. People heard explosions. Have you ever heard of I-beam snap? Think of it this way. If you take like a popsicle stick and snap it, you have that popping sound. Imagine that times like a lot more. You snap an I-beam, it's going to have a pretty rough sound to it. It's going to sound a lot like an explosion. Especially if you have a lot of them snapping all at once. There was a lot going on in there as the buildings were falling down. Let's just put it that way. Boy, that must have been surreal as shit to see that. Just the walking wounded. I mean, that's as close as we'll probably ever get to seeing like The Walking Dead. Just these people walking out of that dust cloud, covered in all that shit, in a daze. Some people barely knowing where they're at, just trying to walk away from all the chaos. That must have been absolutely fucking surreal. Some people in the comments of this video on YouTube have actually said that Rick Blumenthal, who is the reporter that's on the street right now, deserves some kind of a Pulitzer Award for this. I have to agree. This was good stuff, and he was doing it all without a lot of help because he wasn't in communication with the Fox producers. That moment where people started to go into a panic because they heard another airplane, it, that's what was going on for probably a week after that. Was people were just so jumpy about the slightest little sound, and even I, who am not easily shaken, was kind of screwed up by this day because every time I heard a plane going overhead, I would kind of look up and make sure it wasn't flying at something. And that's, like I said, in the area for me, that's tough because I live right next to a major military installation where there's a lot of aircraft coming in and out every day. Well, that's another indication as to how some things can get twisted around in the middle of a traumatic event, as he doesn't even know there was a second plane that hit. I'd be curious, with all the 9/11 related illnesses that have come up in the 18 years since, if Rick Leverthal has come down with any symptoms, because he was as in the shit as anybody was that day. So I'd be interested to know if he's got any long-standing health complications from everything that he experienced that day while he was reporting this incident. That's the thoughts of a real New Yorker right there. That's one of my favorite interviews on this video, actually. We're about to see the second building come down here, if I'm not mistaken.
See the top of the building from here. Oh, yeah. Oh, there it goes, there it goes, there it goes, there it goes. Oh. When it comes down, all right. We do need to put it down now. I think we need to put it down now. Here we go.
America, offer a prayer.
It's very poignant when he says that. There's that silence surrounding it.
Yeah, Brian, what's the latest?
Well, I wanted to tell you, John, that I'm in front of the Capitol, and a moment ago, police officers ran up to us and ordered us off of the grounds and told us, and I quote, there is a plane that has been hijacked. It is 20 minutes south of Washington. This was about 10 minutes ago, and is headed this way. They are taking ultimate precautions. Now, as you know, in these chaotic situations, sometimes information gets twisted. But police officers here are saying that they believe there is a hijacked plane now headed toward Washington. And that's all the information I can give you at this moment.
All right, Brian, we had a
That plane ends up, they believe, being the one that would eventually crash in Pennsylvania near Shanksville. But I'm going to go ahead and end the video there. I invite you to go check this video out if you want to spend 7 hours kind of going through what it was to experience that day in real time. I'll put the link to this video in the description below. You can go find them on YouTube anywhere, really. I know they've got CNN footage. They've got some different footage from local stations that day that you can go find. That those videos aren't as long, so if you just want to try to watch a little bit of it and get a feel for what it was like to see this thing transpire that day in real time, you can go do that. But I invite you to go down to the comments. Let me know where you were that day, how it affected you, what some of your thoughts are. Just leave some well wishes for the almost 3,000 people that were lost that day. We'll end the video there, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. And you know, never forget anything that happened that day. It was the most significant event in this country's history. So we should take a moment on days like today, on the anniversary of this event, to really examine the impact it's had. So I'll see you guys later on.